I mean, the awe in the presence of the genuinely numinous and holy.
Yeah.
That is a really necessary experience. It has to be experienced, viscerally, because it's the experience we've most systematically repressed in the last 300 years. Because we want to be masters of everything. We want to be autonomous. I mean, literally autonomos, a nomos or law unto ourselves. And the thing, when you confront the awesome holiness of God, literally filling you with awe, that has the very salutary effect of immediately putting back into perspective your own ludicrously small plans and ambitions. You see them in the light of this greater majesty, and that leads to humility, which allows you to do things without being constantly tripped up by your own ego. Of course, that experience has to be repeated many times, because it's amazing how quickly the ego will regrow.
Malcolm Guite is a poet, priest, author, profound public speaker and thinker on the reunification of the imagination and reason and the recovery of meaning and truth in modernity, in modern times, through poesis, or subcreation, as Tolkien put it. He's someone that many people on this channel would already know. I'm sure a lot of the I suppose you call it the dark magic of the algorithm probably has linked many audience members from that watch this podcast and to your work, which is very popular on YouTube at the moment. And it's funny, there's something deeply welcoming about it in the way that you arranged the greeting, which is kind of poetic in itself, but it is like, and you've talked about this before in videos, it's like the knocking at the door. It's almost connected to the prodigal son, really. I mean, you've described this in one of your videos, which is
Yes, I mean,
not I'll answer. I'm there. Like, even if you're disturbing me, I'm right here for you.
Yeah. No, in one way, it has a very sort of simple explanation, but in another, it maybe, as you've hinted just there, has some other deeper layers. So the simple thing is that I began that with no idea that it would reach so widely. I began that literally on the first day that our lockdown came very suddenly and was ill prepared for it. The Prime Minister just appeared one evening and said, "Stay at home tomorrow." From tomorrow, it was. So I was a chaplain, and my whole mode of being a chaplain at one of the colleges in Cambridge University was about presence. It was about simple presence. I didn't keep office hours. Anybody could knock on my door anytime. And insofar as I had a spiritual discipline about this and a prayer that went with my role, it was that God would give me the grace to be glad to be interrupted. That as a chaplain, I could get on with all kinds of things, but even if I was in the middle of a sonnet, I took the quote unquote interruption, that the person arriving is also my Lord Christ is arriving in and with that person. That's a sort of almost a Benedictine sense of what the guest is. And the other thing I had learned, over years of personal experience, is that I must then have no agenda. I must simply set aside whatever I'm working on and listen to them. Now, the difficulty, of course, with trying to say, how can I do that for people when I'm stuck at home and they're stuck at home? I had to sort of reinvent myself as cyber chaplain, and I'm by no means a digital native. But I worked out what YouTube was and how to post a video to it. And I thought, well, I'm going to, reflecting on the times when people did knock on my door, and I was always glad to welcome them. The come in, come away, and is actually a thing my mother used to say. I learned hospitality from my mother, just like George Herbert learned it from his. My mother was a most welcoming and hospitable soul. So she'd always say, come away in to people. So that was where that phrase came down to me. And but of course, I now realize I'm saying something much more. I'm saying, come into the depth of the culture that you may have forgotten. Come in to the extraordinary dimensions of your own soul. Come into the God who is the ground of our being, as well as somebody who can be imagined on the heights, and so on. But that develops later. But as I recollected the times when I was able to do this happily and daily in my college, we'd chat about something. I would listen very carefully to what the student had to say, and obviously I didn't have that opportunity in the Zoom because in the YouTube. But like as not, I would find that there was, as it were, a poem or a piece of writing that could speak into whatever that issue was. And I get pleasure from reading things to people, so I would pull a book off the shelf. So I decided that I would try and do this. And my original idea was that perhaps a couple of dozen students who might otherwise have called on me at college would find these videos, and that my wife kindly acts as the proxy and holds the little iPhone and knocks on the door, and I say, come in, and it's a kind of point of view, and they sit down. And I thought, well, I'll do this for a few months until this lockdown lifts, and that was 5 years ago. But I'm very happy to discovered that more and more people were finding this helpful. It was a welcoming space. It was, a lot of people referred to it as a sort of safe haven.
Yeah.
That's right, in the sense that they were going to be safe from controversies and hot button issues and ranting and all of those things. So it was safe in that sense, though perhaps not safe in another sense, in the same sense that, you know, Laszlo is not a tame lion. And if we come in from a way in, we come into depth, sometimes of which some can be quite sort of awe-inspiring. But it was a place of refreshment. So very early on in the series, I read the little passage from Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lucy finds a spell for the refreshment of the spirit. And it turns out the spell for the refreshment of the spirit is a story. And afterwards, she wants to read it again, and she says, oh, there was a tree and a green hill and a sword, you know, and it's actually, you know, the elements of the passion. And then Aslan says, I'll be telling it to you forever. So, yeah, I discovered that I'd created a space that was genuinely a salve to people. And it was genuinely a pleasure to me to do it. So once the plague lifted, as it were, and we were allowed to go out again, I had a huge number of emails saying, please don't stop. So thus far, I have carried on.
Yeah, wow. It also speaks to, especially with COVID, but the utter provoking. We've become sort of homo provoked in modernity, and it's almost become a addiction of this news cycle. So,
Yeah.
in a sense, it's a kind of return to your early priest when you were a priest before you were a chaplain. Because you said, I saw in an interview, you talked about you dealt with a lot of people who were in addiction or they're in really terrible circumstances. And I think that, especially now, it's important to perhaps you've learned something about this type of work is how to get to those people that are in the utter provoked, I call it hell world state, because it's quite hard to make those very first moves out. Those very first, you know, you have sort of like Navy SEALs to say just get up at 4:30 in the morning, you know, bootstrap yourself. But no, it's just those, just that awakening. There's a Have you
But the
learned anything?
awakening of the thing is, I think what you call the hell state, this kind of utterly provoked, it's the surface, as it were, froth that's being whipped up and the waves of opinion crashing against each other and giving us headaches. But to pursue that metaphor, you can go down deep, and the storm above is a tiny thing. You've now begun to get into the depth of your soul, and from there you can do and choose and think in ways that are nothing to do with all the isms and the parties that are raging about at the top. So I think there's always a need to that. This is also a metaphor for poetry, of course. There's a brilliant essay by the late Irish Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney about poetry. It's called Feeling into Words, and he uses this wonderful analogy about, it's talking about his own learning to be a poet, and he compares poetry, the whole of it, to a well, and because he's got wells on the farm he's brought up, and you know, you've got the little mechanism above the well with the winding thing and the rope and the bucket. And he says, every day I used to go when I was trying to be to the well of poetry, and I would make a great clatter with the handle and mostly wind up a taking of air, because I'd never let it. But he says, one day you're doing that and you savor this rich crash as the bucket finally hits the water right down there. And then this is Heaney's phrase. He says, you will have broken the skin of the pool of yourself.
Yeah.
And you can tell you've got something now, because the line, obviously still pursuing the metaphor, the rope line to which the bucket is attached, the line grows taut as you wind up something worth having gone down for. And of course, no poet can write the words, the line goes taut, without thinking about the line of poetry, without thinking that the poetry itself suddenly becomes freighted with meaning and is doing something, rather than just making the noise of the winding of the windlass. So that's a metaphor that Heaney deploys about writing poetry, and indeed it became the subject of having said it in prose, he put it in poetry in a poem called Personal Helicon. But I don't think it's just about that. I think everybody, as it were, has that deep well. They have that depth. Everybody's made in the image of God. There is no such thing as a shallow soul. There are only apparently shallow people, and they're not actually shallow at all. They just haven't been given the time and the place and the calling and the opportunity to get into those depths. And if they did, it's not simply that they would be happier, but they would actually be both less offended and less offensive.
And a depth of sorrow and joy, you know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. There's a really good Christian songwriter called Bob Bennett, and he's got a song called "Is There a Joy Deep as Sorrow?" And happily, the answer to that is yes. But I think it's in the nature of sorrow that usually it's sorrow that teaches us our own depths, and sometimes that literally deepens us. But my conviction is that the sorrow is only deepening us so that we have the capacity for the joy when it comes. But it's the sorrow that does the excavating, sadly.
Well, it actually speaks to, well, I think it's okay, because at least in the depth of the mystic process, that sorrow joy, that I guess you could describe it as the airport feeling, that return to the Father and the leaving the Father, the leaving, for the everyday person to understand, it's that airport feeling when your family are leaving. That's sorrow joy. I think that's an important part of life, at least for me in the mystic process. It's something the suffering is something that you could call it spiritual contraction. It's something that it's part of metamorphosis, but it's something that you are okay with.
Well, I mean, that's true. Although one doesn't want to, one would hate to sound bad. You can be okay with it, but it still hurts. I mean, when one is okay with sorrow, it doesn't cease to be sorrow, but it may then become a fruitful sorrow. I mean, I love, within the Catholic tradition, the idea that there are sorrowful mysteries as well as joyful mysteries. So, yeah, and I think, again, obviously I'm speaking as a Christian here, and as a Christian priest, the life of Christ is as always both the example, but also the efficacious thing inside us. So Jesus wept is extremely important verse to me. I mean, the shortest verse in the New Testament in John, Jesus wept as he goes to see, he weeps at the death of Lazarus, even though he knows he's going to raise Lazarus, he still weeps. And I link that verse in my own mind with the great promise in Revelation. It says, and God will wipe away the tears from every eye. And it's not a promise that we won't cry, but that God will wipe them away. But the reason why I make that link is that if I believed in a God who had never left heaven and was always in a state of uninterrupted bliss, and then we die and somehow without any change or illumination, we're in the bliss. If such a God who had only ever known bliss promised to wipe away a tear from my eye, I would reject it. I'd say, you can't console somebody who's weeping unless you yourself have wept. You can only do it from the inside. So I believe the promise that he will indeed wipe away the tears from our eyes, because he has known as a full human being what it is to weep them. And obviously, that's something we're particularly focused on. Still Lent now. We're into the second half of Lent, and that is partly entering into his sorrows, precisely that he may enter more deeply into ours. Though it's interesting, we're going straight onto, if you like, the kind of mystical life rather than the poetic and imaginative one here. But perhaps
we can synthesize them again, because there was something that I was that this is definitely a line of thought, because there is a deep connection between that that lowering of the water bale into the well and the mystic process in terms of deep silence and concentration until that imagination is actually pierced, I suppose you could say, although it's always collaborative. It's not a will to power pushing through. That's foolish. It's a concentration without effort.
The interesting thing about the well is it's also an image that's been used in literary terms for the imagination itself. There's a great book called The Road to Xanadu by Jonathan Livingston Lowes about Coleridge. And in the course, he's trying to work out how Coleridge was able to write the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Xanadu, these astonishing and permanently fruitful works of the imagination. And the author of this book, he basically went away and read everything that Coleridge had read, and which is quite a feat. And he realized that so many disparate things have gone down almost into his unconsciousness, down into what Livingston Lowes calls the deep well of the imagination, where they're transformed at an almost unconscious level. And then Coleridge, as a poet, is able to get that deep and draw them out again. And now they're not simply a repetition of his reading. There's something new and strange, something rich and strange. In fact, the idea of a thing going down to be transformed is there, of course, in the famous line that Ariel gives in The Tempest. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So the imagine, and in fact, Coleridge, Coleridge, one of the many things we owe to Coleridge is a recovery of the greatness of Shakespeare. Previous critics, not only Milton, but Johnson as well, had called Shakespeare a sort of flawed genius. He was Mother Nature's child, but if only he'd read Aristotle, he would have written better plays, kind of approach. And it was Coleridge who said, no, the genius of Shakespeare is beautiful and natural and organic. It's not, he's not following anybody's fixed rules, but each thing he makes is perfect unto itself. Anyway, when he was writing about Shakespeare, Coleridge said an interesting thing. He said Shakespeare was consciously directing a power and implicit wisdom deeper than consciousness. Now, deeper than consciousness, you have to say he's writing this before Jung, before Freud, before any kind of so-called depth analysis. It was Coleridge, in fact, who coined the phrase subconscious. And he did so in order to try to account for the way our deep imagination is at work, even when we're not consciously doing the imagining. Some kind of shaping power is at work in us. And the poet has to be open to that. And then consciously, it's not like automatic writing. He says Shakespeare is consciously directing a power and implicit wisdom deeper than consciousness. And anybody who writes poetry that is in any sense where obviously a lot of time you sit down to write a poem and it turns out not to be a poem, as Heaney says, you wind up taking air, it's not a keeper. But when you have written a poem which is working at depth, or in which the deeper imagination has been engaged, one of the fascinating things is the discovery that the poem knows more than you do. There are things in the poem that teach you more. And I've had that specific experience quite often with poems where I've published the poem and then somebody's written to me about the poem, about something helpful and fruitful they found in it, which is not consciously in my mind when I wrote the poem. So I go back and reread the poem and I think, oh no, it is there. I trusted to this image. I didn't understand everything about the image, but I trusted that it was the right one. Now, that experience, I mean, amazingly with some of my own poetry, but certainly experience I have again and again with the great poems of the past, for me, speaks of miracle or grace. When a thing, the great Thomistic philosopher Jacques Maritain, French Thomist, neo-Thomist, has an interesting thing where he says, even about ordinary things in the world, he says, things are more than they are, and they give more than they have. That's in an essay called Art and Sacrament. That there's an abundance, there's an overplusness, that there's an irreducibility, even about God's material creation, let alone anything else. And of course, in the essay, he says there are certain points, sacrament on the one hand, where he says of this bread, this is also my body, and then this is me for you, and so, and art on the other, where if you pay sufficient attention and serve something, a vision that you've had, or even just the attempt to describe a sunrise or to paint it, the more attention you pay to it, the more you find in it. And if you serve it well enough to make a shaped thing into which something of what you've observed has entered, then you may create a piece of art, music or painting or poetry, which is, as it were, like the TARDIS. It's sort of bigger on the inside than the outside. Now, when that happens, I don't see any purely human explanation for that. I see something of divine gift in it. And the bit of scripture that helps me to make sense of it is the bit in Genesis about when he says about humankind, let us make man in our image and likeness. And obviously the image and likeness is the image and likeness of a God who is himself a creator. Tolkien put this very well in his poem Mythopea, where he says, we make still by the law by which we're made. And I think probably one of the most singular and astonishing gifts that he has given, and I don't think he's just given this to so-called special people who are called artists, I think he's given this to everybody, is that we have this gift of creativity, of glimpsing something, recombining things, and producing a work which is more than itself. I don't distinguish between, I think a mother who bears children and brings them up and kindles, life and love and, carefulness and honor and duty in those children is any less of a creative artist than Shakespeare writing a sonnet. In fact, she's probably much more of a creative artist. And she may also be a creative artist in the other sense as well. She may be one of the great women poets as well. But I believe that all the material of life that we're given with is something which we can shape imaginatively and bring into its own beauty and power.
I think there's also a degree to which there are other, especially with people who engage in, I'm sure Shakespeare did, in deep contemplation, in in silence of some kind, other agents at work. It's not always like that's what you're alluding to as well. It's a conduit. There's a degree to which you can be a conduit, but I think of course that requires a lot of work to be able to do. People think, oh, if I just sit here. Well, yes, if you sit somewhere and you work out a procedure, you contemplate in silence and concentration. It has to be earned. You have to put in a seventh of the time to get to.
In the case of writing, the best ideas come not what before you start, but once you've started, things start occurring to you, words start matching each other, things which you would never have thought of originally, but which shows that you're now engaged in this process. Going back to our mention of Valentin Tomberg, there's a very, I think his account of is it the fool? There's the batailleur. He has the image of this person who's balancing, who found a point of balance and is allowing parallel and contrary forces to reconcile and balance, and that there is in that an element of playfulness. I mean, we're talking very seriously about art, and that's a proper thing to do if we're doing a podcast about art and meaning, but there is something is almost unconsciously, unself-consciously playful in the work of creation. There's a lightness of touch as well. And I see that in all things. I mean, actually, I also see it. I see it in Christ. There's a playfulness sometimes in his responses to people, where he takes their terms and flips them upside down and turns them around and gives them back to them, or even the thing he does with the coin, where they're trying to catch him out about taxes to Caesar, and he goes for the coin, and God, who's this? So yeah, and I quite like it when you see it's one of Chesterton's very first books was called Greybeards at Play. And, you know, being a greybeard myself now, I don't want to forget that playful element.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's there's a connection there with that synthesis, that concentration without effort that's talked about in that chapter, and some of the stuff that you've talked about before with Shakespeare when you expertly unpack his apprehending and comprehending
Oh, yeah.
his.
Yeah.
And this is so, it goes, your interpretation goes even further into the actual mystic practice of this. And I'll just draw the symbol. This is an old alchemist symbol, of course, and then it's Gwen Honest talked about this in Symbols of Sacred Science. You know, that symbol, it's the point in the middle and the circle
Yeah.
around it. The circle around it is that comprehending. The apprehending is kind of that concentration point, right?
Yeah.
And so the concentration point is also connected with the original apprehending of a poem, but in mystic practice, it's also the attending of the middle of vision and all of vision while you're praying. And that's also connected with that comprehending, that synthesis, the comprehending. When you stare out the window, when you daydream out the window, that's what you kind of attend the all of vision without realizing it, right? And so this imagination is kind of behind you in a way. And so when you're doing your mystic practice, I'm making a connection here between the poesis and also mystic practice. They actually, in a way, do the same thing, and perhaps Shakespeare was even.
Yeah, I think they do, and they're and this is also to do with vision. One of the fruits of a certain kind of mystic practice clearly is visionary experience, and we see it clearly in the prophets, and often what that vision is often described as a kind of lifting of the veil, that you see things for a moment in the splendor and glory of their eternal state in all its minute particulars, as Blake says. And it's as though this heavy black cloth, this veil, this thing that Coleridge called the film of familiarity, has been lifted for a moment. And an obvious moment of vision is you know, Jesus being seen by the Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. He's transfigured before them. I don't think that's because at that moment Jesus becomes especially shiny. I think it's simply that they glimpse in and with and through the human nature, the divine nature that was always there, but was kind of occluded from them. And so that idea that you can see more clearly, and what you see, even if the vision for you is only momentary, the thing you're seeing is permanent and eternal. It's just that you had momentary access to it. T.S. Eliot is constantly trying to get at what that is in the four quartets. And he says, quick, now, here, now, always, you know, and this is beautiful, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. But on another occasion, when he has one of these mystic visions and then falls out of it, he has this beautiful line. He says, ridiculous, the waste, sad time stretching before and after. After that. So the mystic does that. And I think what Shakespeare is saying is that the artist is trying to do something similar. The poet is trying to do something similar. But what the poet is doing is not simply having the vision, but creating, embodying it, giving it some kind of accessible shape. So you were alluding to apprehend and comprehend, perhaps just to bring your listeners in on the picture there. What we're alluding to there, what I was alluding to, is a famous account of poetry in Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, Midsummer Night's Dream is talking about play. It's one of the most playful of all the plays, and it's full of magic, and it's kind of flooded with moonlight. It's very much, as the title suggests, about the relationship between dream and waking, and which is the clearer state, and all of that is going on. But one of the characters in it, Theseus, the Duke of Athens, is presented to us by Shakespeare as a bluff pragmatist, you know, who doesn't believe in any of this airy-fairy stuff at all. So he claims. But we're later told that Titania, the fairy queen, did in fact lead him glimmering through the magic woods when he was a teenager. So he's maybe taking revenge on his earlier insights. In fact, I think most people who call themselves bluff pragmatists and have no time for mysticism are almost certainly pressing mystic experience because it doesn't fit with their current worldview, but it's having happened nevertheless. Anyway, the point is, he's hostile, so he claims to poetry. He says, I never may believe these, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet of imagination all compact. But then Shakespeare puts into the mouth of this hostile witness perhaps the most beautiful description of poetry, and indeed I would say of all art ever. He sets it up by making this contrast, which you yourself have just alluded to, between two modes of knowing, apprehension and comprehension. And he says that fancy or imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Which is already conceding, that, well, if poetry is to do with apprehension, then we need it. In fact, he goes on to suggest that poetry woos apprehension into comprehension. So what he says is this: the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And then he says later, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So obviously the scope, heaven, earth, earth, heaven, would be resonant with any mystic. The trying, how do you bring them together? And then the most astonishing thing is the juxtaposition of the words imagination and bodies. Most people would think imagination is in one realm and body is in another, and they would have this kind of Cartesian dualism. Not at all. Shakespeare says the job of imagination is to give body to things. So imagination apprehends, if you like, the heavenly, the invisible, the unembodied. But it's no good to us up there in invisible unembodiedness. We have to encounter it in the world, in the sensory world. So imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So that is to say, an unknown thing can now be known in a new way, but the only way of knowing it is through the imagination. The imagination is therefore a truth-bearing faculty, and it bears truth just to the degree that it is willing to be incarnate, to body forth. In fact, I have argued in various books that I think Shakespeare is riffing in this passage about poetry on the prologue to John's Gospel. That, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word is unembodied and up there and inaccessible. But then in John 1:14, you get this astonishing, to many scandalous line, the scandal of particularity, that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. That God, the Creator, as it were, bodies forth all that he is, all the mystical truths of heaven and the eternal love and the Trinity and everything, which we couldn't possibly arrive at by ourselves and could certainly never deserve, is simply embodied for us in a person whom we can get to know and whom we can see and in whom we can see glory. And I don't think that embodying has ever stopped. In fact, I think when he says of the bread, this is my body, or where he says much more radically and scandalously of the church, this is my body, or where even more challengingly he says of the poor stranger who's asked you to give him water or bread or clothe him, he's also saying this is me, So once you start bodying forth, in a sense, you can't stop, and that's why, I mean, speaking as somebody who, I have a small participation in what you might call Christian mysticism, but it's very Christian mysticism. Before I returned to my faith, I was essentially oscillating between being a high Platonist and being a sort of slightly pretentious Zen disciple. But the point of both of those things is that it was all very disembodied. It was very ethereal. And that is the danger of certain kinds of mystical experience, is that it becomes dualist and it has contempt for the world and the body. But I think because of the incarnation, Christian mysticism has always to be bodied forth and to love the body. And likewise, Christian art, I think art isn't necessarily embodied form, but it doesn't mean it's stuck with the body. It doesn't mean that it's not reductive. It's not saying, oh, everything is merely material. We're just random neurons firing in the vacuity of space. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is precisely the opposite, that there is nothing random, that there is no material thing which is not infinitely alive with meaning and glimpses of heaven. It makes the body the vehicle embodying forth of something always more than itself. So that's why I think all the reductive views, including the politically reductive views, are essentially wrong. I mean, when Lewis was asked at the very end of his life, what was the core of his effort in writing, he simply said two words, because words were short and he was an ill man. He said, against reductivism.
Yeah. Well said by him.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so funny you talk about the embodiment of it, and I very much agree with everything you're saying in terms of real Christianity is a synthesis of those things. Right? The logos is the ground of the subject and the object.
Mm.
You know, it's
That's
the
perfect. That's exactly it. The point is, it's both subject and object. The logos is real and makes other things real, and yet the logos is also the inside perception of everything.
yeah. And it's looking through. The problem with the empiricist is that everything he looks at is on that surface everyday facticity of the naive. Or that's it's a harsh word to use, but it's the naive world picture. And all of modernity is created of that. But if you just
All it is, that's why the little verse of George Herbert is so important when he says, "A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heavens espy." And we just happen to have been born, you and I, into a tiny little corner of human culture, which only about 200 or 300 years ago, perversely chose to stay its eye on the glass and not look through it, and then went around persuading everybody that the glass is all there is.
There are clues that also you were going to continue.
So we have to rebel against that. And as with all great rebellions, there are always recoveries of something that's been lost or forgotten. And what we're recovering is the deep, pre-modern Christian mystic tradition, which turns out to be extremely helpful for navigating postmodern times.
Yeah. In fact, the tradition, the further we get on with complexity science and quantum mechanics, the more the traditional picture explains and reductivism, that even the complexity science can't explain. They're just struggling to catch up with angels. They start talking about hyperagents. So, what is that? It's an angel, or it's a demon, or an egregore, as is talked about in the more esoteric. But also, some of the stuff you spoke about reminds me of Heidegger too. Language being the house of being, but also the body you're talking about. The body it's something that of imagination. You actually go through that to deeper levels of intuition and gnosis in terms of imagination. It's like a whole. It's like a human word you could call it. It's something as a whole. It's being as a whole. You can actually
in its imagination. I mean, it's very interesting. Lewis again very helpfully said that whilst reason was the natural organ of truth, imagination was the organ of meaning. It's the thing which sees the point and the whole and the connection and the synthesis of things. In fact, Coleridge called it synthesizing power. This is why now we're always laboring under a difficulty when we want to defend the imagination the way we're doing, is because a very minor sense of what it is has now come to become its dominant meaning. The minor sense of what it is being able to make up an imaginary story or have an imaginary friend. So imaginary in the sense of not physically present and somehow ergo as being not real. So, and we've got to say, no, you engage your imagination in every act of perception. It's the living power and prime agent of every perception. And even the things that you make up, when Dickens writes a novel, of course, it's not real in one sense, in that there wasn't, regrettably, ever a Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or a Bob Cratchit or a Tiny Tim. But everybody knows that book is about truth. Everybody knows there is a tendency to the Scrooge in them, but there's also the possibility of a Tiny Tim in them. It's bristling with truth. It's absolutely alive with truth about as all these great novels are. So it doesn't take, we engage in what Coleridge called the willing suspension of disbelief. which for the moment constitutes poetic faith. Now, nobody's being deceived there. It's not a lie.
Yeah.
It's not a made up thing. If you're reading a novel or a poem, you've agreed to be enchanted by the poet, but you agree to it because you know that inside the enchantment, he will give you images which body forth real truths to which you would otherwise perhaps have no access or couldn't put a name to.
Yes, and I think on that point of enchantment, just looking at reality itself, or how being presence is to us, let's say, is that there is an unfortunate word I think gets used a lot called re-enchantment, as if there needs to be an additive, as if the life and the way, like truth is not truth without the life and the way.
I totally understand why people want to have re-enchantment, because they're saying, I'd love to live in an enchanted world. Let's re-enchant it. But that's a misnomer, because it's not that the world has ever been unenchanted. What happened was that we took an illusory and deliberately disenchanted view of nature. We pretended to each other that it was not enchanted and it was in fact just a bunch of dead stuff. And we did so specifically for the purpose of exploiting it. Because obviously if you have a mutually, going back to the whole original courtesy and welcome and acknowledging, if you had, as we once had, a mutually courteous relationship with the rest of creation, where like Francis, you could talk about brother sun and sister moon, and you know, you'd be less likely to completely destroy it. Whereas if you think it's dead stuff and the only meaning or consciousness is islanded in the concavity of your skull, then you're more likely to destroy it. But that idea that it was dead stuff and therefore unenchanted.
The second part of this conversation is available for fellowship joiners. The links are in the replies. Join my website at scottmannion.com/fellowship or on substack.scottmannion.com.